Hope at Dawn. A Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorized voice replica. Chapter 1. As the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving its fiery glow resting upon the gently rolling black waters, Nicholas Sidemore spotted the boat for which he had been waiting, bobbing just on the edge of the sea, where the water dropped away and could be seen no longer. His heart raced at the sight of her, and he swallowed the fear that rose inside him as the vessel drew closer. It would not be long now, a few hours or perhaps a day, until he knew his fate. Using the glow of his lantern to light the way, he carefully picked his way around the rocks lining the shore. Choosing a large one with a smooth top, he sat down. From this vantage point he could easily see the entrance to the harbour and past it to the sea beyond. This was where he had sat every night for over a fortnight waiting for that boat. When 3 and then 4 days of waiting had stretched into weeks, he had thought she had chosen not to return. However, there the boat was, 3 weeks late, but with its course obviously set for the bay. "She's arriving before dawn." A man of slightly smaller stature but with similar features to Nicholas's slid onto the rock next to him. "I hear tell by the other captains that there has been some bad weather. It is probably the cause of her running so late." Nicholas nodded. That was probably the reason. Bad weather. It could not be anything else. It just could not be. For he would not allow his mind to travel down that dark and dreary path. He had spent a year next to it and even been chased down it a time or two by the demons who lurked there. It was not a place he wished to visit again. Therefore he pushed his doubts aside, propped his elbows onto his knees, and resting his chin in his hands, watched. "She's arriving before dawn." His brother's voice broke the silence which had settled in around them. While he repeated exactly what he had said before, Nicholas knew that Jonathan was no longer speaking of the ship. "And unwed," Jonathan added. "She did not marry?" Nicholas turned toward his brother, who shook his head in reply. "How do you know?" "Castleton." A small flicker of hope flashed in Nicholas's heart. If anyone knew the details of all that was happening in town with its current or past residents, it was Adam Castleton. However, just as quickly as the hope sprang up in his heart, Nicholas tucked it away. And how does Castleton know? No matter how much Nicholas wanted to hope that she had waited for him, he could not yet, for the disappointment would be too great if she had not. When Lady Kathleen Witherfield had left over a year ago with her family, Rupert Dunnerby had joined them. And Nicholas knew that Kathleen's brother and father had both been in favour of a match with Dunnerby. Dunnerby had money and held a promise of more. Unfortunately, Nicholas had only held a promise of riches a year ago, and a promise of wealth was not enough for the likes of the Witherfield men. He had a letter from Witherfield that said Dunnerby is not on board the Mary Ellen. There was some sort of disagreement, and Dunnerby booked passage on a boat heading to the West Indies. According to Castleton, Witherfield and his sister were not sorry to see him go. Nicholas drew in a breath and released it slowly. The fear that gripped his heart began to relax its hold, but just slightly. He knew that being unwed and willing to wed him were two very different things. Kathleen Witherfield pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and leaned against the hull of the ship. Overhead a lantern swayed on its hook, causing shadows to dance about the cabin. Although it was well past midnight, and she should be sleeping, she was not. The mixture of excitement and trepidation which swirled within her made sleep an impossibility. Reaching beneath her pillow, she pulled out a worn letter. Carefully she unfolded it and smoothed it on her lap. The flickering light from the lantern was poor, but she did not need the light to read what was written on the page. She had read this letter so many times that the words would likely always be a part of her memories. "My dearest Kathleen, I cannot describe the deep, dark and dank despair which my heart feels tonight, as I pen these words of farewell. They are not words I write willingly. Would that I was able to provide for you in a manner your father deemed acceptable. But I cannot. I can only promise to strive to do so. But what security is there in that? I do not blame your father for refusing me." Maybe Nicholas could not blame her father, but she could. And she did. She had been furious at her father's refusal and horrified at his proposed alternative. Rupert Dunnerby was a liar and a cheat, and she had known it almost from their first meeting. Unfortunately, her father and brother had not seen Rupert as she had, at least not in time. She let out a heavy, sorrowful sigh and with a shake of her head to clear the memories of her father, returned to the letter. "I beg of you not to accept Mr. Dunnerby. Give me time to make my fortune. Wait for me, Kathleen. Give me 1 year to increase my holdings. I shall toil night and day so that when you return, I will be able to provide for you as your father requires. Please do not refuse me this request, for I cannot bear the thought of you with another. I shall look for your answer on the tree behind the church. If I see your locket, I will know you will return to me to retrieve it." A tear slid down her cheek as her hand moved of its own volition to clasp the locket which hung around her neck. Carefully she folded the letter and slipped it once again beneath her pillow, before snuggling down next to the infant who shared her bed. Chapter 2. "Heave to!" came the call. Deckhands scurried around above deck, and rigging creaked and groaned. "Shh! We won." Kathleen stroked the head of the baby girl who rested in her arms and had awoken as the infant began to fuss. "You will be at your new home soon." The child had found the journey from Ireland to England to be trying. The constant swaying of the boat had unsettled her, and she had not eaten as she should. What she had eaten had not always stayed with her. She was beginning to look frail. Kathleen hummed softly, hoping the familiar tune would calm both Anya and herself. Anya's small fist found its way to her mouth, the suckling action soothing her. And soon the tune did its work, coaxing both the child and the lady who held her to drift off to sleep. Not half an hour later, Douglas Witherfield shook his sister's shoulder gently. "We are home, Kathy. We are home." Kathleen opened her eyes slowly and stretched as much as one could while holding a baby. She gave her brother a half smile. That word home sounded so welcoming. And yet it also held a great deal of uncertainty. All will be well. It was what her brother had said to her many times during this voyage, and she wished to believe him now just as she did each of the other times he had said it. She knew that he felt keenly the pain of being duped by Rupert Dunnerby. How could he not when the man's perfidious nature had led to the death of their father and uncle? However, seeing the concern in his eyes, she nodded her agreement. Though she was less sure he was correct this time than any other time he had repeated the same assurance. She licked her lips and swallowed. Have you seen who might be on the shore?" "I have not seen Sidemore, but if Castleton received my letter, which I am certain he did, then surely the gossips have spread the news that you are unwed, and Dunnerby is long gone. But that will not ensure he knows that I would welcome his suit." That was likely her greatest fear, that Nicholas would not welcome her. If only her locket had remained where she had placed it, instead of finding its way back to her by a well-meaning maid. He has done well for himself, even Papa said so. Her brother's replying smile was tight. He has, but if he's not waiting for you, he is an idiot. Douglas opened the door to the cabin and motioned for her to go before him. She paused in front of him. Nicholas has no reason to hope. She tried to keep the bitterness from her voice, but could not. "When Molly returned my locket, you were quite happy she had." He caught her by the elbow before she could move away from him. "I was a fool, Kathleen." He turned her back towards him. "I should have trusted you." He unclasped her locket and placed it in his pocket. Her free hand flew to her throat as she turned toward him. "What are you doing?" He placed a hand on her shoulder and held her gaze for a moment, waiting for her to calm, as he often did when she was about to fly into the rafters. Then he turned her toward the ladder which led to the deck. After she had arranged Anya into a position that allowed her to ascend the ladder, he stood close by, ready to assist her if needed. Only when she had begun to climb to the deck above did he answer her question. "Do you wish him to see you wearing it? He will think you chose to abandon him." She looked back at her brother with wide eyes. "I had not thought of that." She allowed the nursemaid to take Anya from her as she reached the deck so that she could straighten her skirts. Then, as the child began to fuss once again, she took Anya back and held her close to her heart, cooing to her until she calmed. Douglas had gained the deck and was standing close behind her, his eyes searching the crowds until he saw the man he sought. Placing a hand on his sister's back, he nudged her forward, so that they might complete the process of disembarking. Once on shore, he made sure she was on her way to the waiting carriage before pushing his way through the crowds, stopping in front of a man who was watching Kathleen closely. Douglas took the necklace from his pocket. "Here, He grabbed Sidemore's hand and placed the locket inside it. "This was meant for you." He turned to go back to his sister, but thought better of it and added, "A call, as soon as possible, would not be unwelcomed." "Of course," Nicholas stammered, as Witherfield turned and hurried away. Slowly he opened his hand and lightly ran a finger over the flowers which were etched into the face of the locket. A smile touched his lips for a moment. What did Witherfield want? Jonathan placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "He wanted to give me this." Nicholas held out his hand. "Is that the locket? The one that was not left behind the church?" Nicholas nodded. "Witherfield said it was meant for me." He tucked the necklace into his pocket as he watched the Witherfield coach round the corner and drive out of sight. "However, if I was meant to have it, I am sure there must have been some way in the past year to let me know." He turned to walk toward home. He needed time to think. His brother stepped in front of him. "You're not going to follow her? You're just going to let her go?" Nicholas pushed him aside and kept walking. "I do not know what I am going to do." He knew what he wanted to do, but was that what he should do? She had returned, but she had not returned alone. The image of her standing on the deck of the ship with a baby in her arms could not be easily cast aside. Jonathan, whose legs were not so long as his taller and older brother's were, trotted up beside Nicholas. "Well, you are a daft fool if you do not at least make an attempt to win her." His brother was likely right, but it was not his brother's heart which had been shattered a year ago. "Witherfield hands you permission to pursue his sister, the only woman to whom you have ever lost your heart," Jonathan continued, "and you do not know what you're going to do?" Nicholas glared at his brother and grabbed him by the arm, dragging him off the path. "Good day," he said, as he tipped his hat to a lady of their acquaintance, who was out on an early morning stroll following behind her child, who rode in a baby carriage pulled by a small pony and led by a young groom. "Mrs. Edger," Jonathan also tipped his hat. "Keep your voice down," growled Nicholas. "You know my business will be about town in less than an hour if she heard you." "My apologies, brother, but you are still a daft fool." Nicholas sighed. He was going to have to explain a portion of the thoughts going through his mind for his brother to leave him be. "While it is true that Witherfield gave me an opening, have you asked yourself why a man who was so firmly set against me a year ago now nearly throws his sister at me? A sister who arrives back in town unwed and carrying a child, and whose approved suitor has fled after an apparent disagreement with that same disapproving brother." He closed his eyes, unwilling to allow his brother to see the full extent of his pain. "Perhaps I am merely good enough to claim her now because no one else will." He turned away, his steps slower and heavier now than they had been a moment ago. Jonathan grabbed his arm, but Nicholas shrugged him off. "Go about your business, Jonathan. I need time to think." "I will be home for tea." Jonathan called to the back of his brother. "See that you're still there." Nicholas nodded and held up his right hand in acceptance. It was not as if he was going to do something dire. He only needed some time to sort through his thoughts. Jonathan watched his brother trudge away and shook his head. A woman of Kathleen's rank would not come back to her home in disgrace. She would have remained in Ireland. Hopefully his brother would come to that conclusion as well. However, just in case he didn't, Jonathan knew what his first order of business was to be today. He needed to find Castleton, and some answers. Chapter 3. The aromas and sounds of morning greeted Jonathan as he stepped into the public house, where he knew Castleton always broke his fast. He knew it because he also sought a table in the corner of this particular establishment each morning, the same table at which with any luck Castleton would now be sitting. "Pardon me, sir." A maid, carrying a large platter of bacon and toast in one hand and 2 mugs of ale in the other, squeezed her way past Jonathan as he doffed his cap. His stomach rumbled as his eyes roamed over the many patrons in the establishment to his customary corner table. "Some breakfast for you, sir?" Another maid appeared at his side, standing far closer than necessary, and interrupting his survey of the room. He took a step away. "Just breakfast, Jenny?" She pouted playfully at him. It was the usual greeting of the morning. She always tried to capture his attention, and he always gave her only as much as was needed. "Have you seen Castleton?" "I have." She stepped teasingly close once again, looking up at him through her lashes. He laughed down at her. "Could you point me in his direction and then bring me my breakfast?" "I'll take you to him." Jack Cotter, the proprietor of the tavern, stood at Jonathan's elbow. "Get his breakfast, Jenny." Jenny smiled once more at Jonathan, before placing a kiss on Jack's cheek. He swatted her backside as she turned to leave. Impudent woman! She tossed a saucy grin over her shoulder. Jonathan laughed. I never take her flirting seriously, Jack. Your wife is safe from me. I've no doubt of that, and Jenny knows it. She only flirts with those like you and Castleton, as neither of you pays her any heed. Jack led Jonathan through the crowded room to his table in the corner. Castleton, young Sidemore here is looking for you. Adam Castleton took a drink of his coffee to wash down the piece of toast he had been eating. Thank you, Jack. He smiled at Jonathan and motioned for him to join him. It is a happy day for your brother. One would have thought. Jonathan nodded his thanks to Jack for the cup of coffee which was placed before him. However, my brother is an idiot. Castleton's brows rose in surprise. Did Witherfield not make certain to let him know he was acceptable as a suitor? He sat back, the remains of his morning feast forgotten for a moment. Witherfield gave him the locket, but no explanation. A plate of food was placed before him. The locket, Castleton repeated. The one which was not where it was expected to be a year ago. Jonathan nodded as he tucked into his breakfast. That was the symbol of her acceptance. What explanation was needed? Castleton asked. Apparently, Jonathan said between bites of bacon, if you are my brother, and if the woman you love's brother, who at one time found you lacking, now gives you permission to court his sister, who has returned after a prolonged stay in Ireland unwed but carrying an infant, it must mean she is in need of rescuing, and you are her only hope. Castleton's mouth hung open for a full minute before he snapped it shut. Of all the half-witted notions I have heard him spout, and there have been plenty, that has to be the most asinine. He threw his napkin down on the table and snatched up his hat. If Witherfield hears of this, he will be calling him out for questioning Kathleen's virtue. Jonathan laid a hand on Castleton's arm before the man could rise from his chair. Finish your food. Nicholas will not speak of it. However, if you could perhaps explain the presence of the child, about which I assume you know. He cocked an eyebrow in question. The child is her cousin. Truly? Yes. It would not be the first time such an explanation has been used, Jonathan cautioned. No, you are correct. But in this instance the child is Lady Kathleen's cousin. Both her aunt and uncle perished, one in childbirth and the other in that fire. Then, if you could share such information with Nicholas, before the blockhead takes it upon himself to inquire about it from Witherfield, I would be much appreciative. I have no desire to stand as his second, or to inherit his fortune in such a fashion. Castleton huffed and shook his head before finishing off his breakfast. When you are finished, he said as he wiped his mouth, perhaps we could pay a call on your brother? Jonathan nodded as he sopped up the last of his egg with his toast. 2 bites. Castleton drummed his fingers on the table as he waited none too patiently for Jonathan to finish those 2 bites and wash it down with the remains of his coffee. Then, snatching up his hat, he hurried toward the door. Wait, Jonathan called as he tossed his money on the table and ran to catch Castleton. Adam! It was a name he only used when he needed his lifelong friend's full attention. The effect was immediate as Castleton stopped and turned to look at him. Nicholas is at home. He motioned in the opposite direction. Nick is at home when there is money to be made? Castleton's face registered his surprise. Nicholas Sidemore was not known to leave the running of his bank to his employees without his oversight. He is, and if my impression of his mood this morning was correct, he is sitting in the garden staring at the church. It was where Nicholas had sat every day for 2 weeks after the Witherfields had left. He had refused to eat more than once a day, and he only ate then, because Jonathan had begged him to do so. To be perfectly honest, Jonathan had thought his brother was going to purposefully do himself harm during those days. It was why he had promised to be at tea today, for the expression his brother had worn this morning at their parting was so reminiscent of the way he had looked back then. Castleton drew a deep breath and exhaled it along with much of his frustration as he shook his head. He is confused. It was not a question, and so Jonathan made no reply. Well then, I shall tell him a story, rather than deliver the lecture he rightfully deserves. It would do far more good, my friend, Jonathan assured him. And together the two turned and started toward the Sidemore residence. Chapter 4. The Witherfields' carriage drew to a stop in front of a shop on the high street. We have servants who can do this, Kathleen. Yes, I know. Kathleen snuggled a sleeping Anya more closely to her. I am sure they have been working diligently to prepare for our arrival. The apothecary is on our way, and it would be foolish to drive all the way home just to send someone back to do what I can do myself. Foolish and inefficient. She waited for her brother to exit the coach and extend his hand to her. I would like to be prepared for when Anya wakes. I do not have any tonic remaining. We're on dry ground, Kathy. There is no swaying of the ship to make her uneasy. Perhaps, but I still feel the sway. Do you not? Kathleen placed her hand in the crook of his arm. How long did it take you to no longer feel that sway when we arrived in Ireland? Was it a few days, or was it weeks? Douglas shook his head in resignation. He knew that when his sister was bent on an idea, logic and reasoning were the only hope of changing her mind, and he was well aware that his argument was based on things less noble, such as the longing for a bath and a bed in which he could stretch out fully. There was nothing to be done but to agree with her, and so he did. Yes, nearly a week. She's so frail, Douglas, he sighed, as he heard the tears that lay behind the softly spoken words. I know, you're right. We must make sure she has everything she needs. It is as Father and Uncle Barrett would have wished. He ran the back of a finger down the baby's soft cheek. She is sweet. Kathleen smiled at him. For all his sighs and grumbling, he was rather more of a kitten than a lion at times. She is that. And you'll not be spoiling her, Douglas Witherfield? He laughed, a deep rumbling sound she'd not heard much in the past year. It is good to be home, she said as she stepped into the apothecary shop. Oh, and with a wee one on her hip. I thought it strange how quickly they left. Mrs. Edger stood at the counter of the shop. Her back was to the door, and therefore she had no idea that the object of her tattling had just entered. Mrs. Benson, the apothecary's wife, cleared her throat in an attempt to silence the woman. And then I heard the Sidemore brothers discussing a need for her to be rescued. Well, I can tell you, a woman of such loose morals as to have a child out of wedlock needs rescuing by more than man. And to flaunt loose morals? Mrs. Edger spun to see who had spoken to her. Lady Kathleen, it is good to see you. I trust your travels were not too arduous. Were it not for the bright pink colour that stained the woman's cheeks, Kathleen would have thought her unaffected at having been caught spreading tales. Not for us, but our cousin did not fare as well as we did, said Douglas. The mild kitten from before was gone, replaced by the gruff and imposing Earl. He nodded to Anya. She needs more of this. He pulled a small bottle from his pocket and handed it to Mrs. Benson. So this is your cousin? There was an odd inflection of Mrs. Edger's voice at the word, as if she did not believe it to be true. Yes. This is Anya Witherfield, daughter of Barrett and Erin Witherfield, my aunt and uncle. You do remember them, do you not? There was quite a scandal when they married, and I know how fond you are of a scandal. A smile tugged at his lips when he heard her gasp. I assume you have heard of the tragedy we all suffered of late, when both Anya's father and my own died? Mrs. Edger gave only a small nod of her head to confirm that she had heard. I do hope that what my sister heard as we entered was not about her, Douglas continued. Deep red spread across the woman's face. Of course not, my lord. But the lady in need of rescue. Kathleen wore a particularly tight smile. It was the Sidemore brothers who were discussing her. At the woman's nod, she continued, And how did these gentlemen come to know she was in need of rescuing? Mrs. Edger gave a quick glance at Douglas before lowering her gaze to the floor. I heard one of them mention her brother, my lady. Douglas watched his sister's shoulders rise and fall 3 times before she spoke. Thank you, Mrs. Edger. I must call at Hazelton House to see what I can do to assist the young lady. She waited until the woman had left before she turned to her brother. He winced when he saw the thunder in her eyes. Are we stopping at Hazelton House on the way home? He asked. Well, there is a woman in need of rescue. Is there not, my lord? Rescuing should not be put off, you know. Kathleen. She held up a hand to stop him. Not in public, my lord. I will wait for you in the carriage. He sighed as she left the store. She never called him my lord unless she was beyond angry. The ride home was not going to be a pleasant one. Would my lord require some headache powder? Mrs. Benson asked with a knowing smile. Yes, Mrs. Benson. I do believe I shall be in need of some. She's a good girl, my lord. I'd not believe an ill word spoken of her, and neither would many others. He smiled at the elderly woman whom he had known since before he was in breeches. She may be a good girl, but she has a wicked temper. Ay, my lord, she's as beautiful and deadly as a summer's day when the clouds roll in. She chuckled as she wrapped his parcel. Let her blow, and 'twill soon be past. "I pray you are right, Mrs. Benson." "Thank you." And with that he took the package and headed for the carriage and the waiting storm. Chapter 5. Nicholas sat with his back resting against the large tree that stood on the top of a small rise in the garden at Hazleton House. Here, with the church in view, he could more easily remember the counsel he had received from Mr. Baxter. "You must have faith and hope, but above all you must have love," he had said. "Have hope when the skies are grey, have faith when the way is unclear, and have love that is unwavering even in the face of trial." He blew out a breath, trying to rid himself of the dark images of the time when Mr. Baxter had spoken those words to him. It was guidance he had needed then, and now. When he had found the hollow in the tree which overshadowed the grave markers of his relations, empty those many months ago, his heart had been shattered. It was wise counsel such as Mr. Baxter's, along with the care and companionship of Jonathan and Castleton, that had kept him from being consumed by the dark melancholy which had descended on him. It was that darkness which currently poked at the edges of his mind, and which kept him from running to Witherfield Hall. He leaned his head back against the tree and closed his eyes. Emptiness filled his breast, causing him to clutch the locket in his hand tightly. She had meant this for him. Her brother had said that she had. He blew out a slow breath. Could he find the courage to discover if what her brother said was true? A shoulder bumped his as someone took a seat next to him. Cracking one eye slightly open, he cast a glance at his friend. "Go away," he grumbled, though he knew that such an order was not about to be heeded. "In a moment," Castleton said. "I wish to inform you that I am in the market for a wife, and if you do not seek her hand, I will. I stepped aside 2 years ago, when it was obvious she was enamoured with you, but I'll not step aside again if you do not put yourself forward." He made to rise, but paused to take one more shot. "Apparently I have more faith in her than you do. Perhaps I'll not give you a chance." Nicholas grabbed Castleton's sleeve before he could rise. "No, she will not be yours." Fear, much greater than what he'd felt up until now, grasped his heart and threatened to crush it in its grip. Castleton rarely made empty threats. "Why should she not be mine?" Castleton said. "I do not see any others lining up to call on her." Nicholas released Castleton's sleeve with a shove, sending him sprawling. "Because I love her." He waited for Castleton to scramble from the ground. "Now tell me what you came to tell me. I have somewhere I need to be." No one was going to take Kathleen from him again. She would have to send him away if she did not want him. He would not be prevented from presenting his suit to her by anyone. Castleton studied the face of his friend. He saw the uncertainty in his eyes and the determination of his mouth. He watched the pronounced rise and fall of his friend's chest and heard the deep drawing of breath. "Then why are you here under this tree instead of dashing after her? And what dark demon possessed you, besides your propensity to find disaster where there is none, to make you think the child you saw was hers? My propensity, as you call it, does not follow logical paths, as you well know." Nicholas rose to his feet. "But it is a demon, one that, at times such as these, needs solitude to defeat. Mr. Baxter has taught me many things over the past year." He ran a hand through his hair before rubbing the back of his neck. "I needed a few moments to remember them. And having remembered, what are your plans?" Castleton stood beside him. "The child is not hers?" Nicholas asked. Castleton shook his head. "Do you really think of her as the seducing type?" "No, but—" Nicholas turned away from his friend. "It does not matter to me if it is hers. I love her. There is nothing which can alter that fact. But I will admit that my heart and mind would rest a bit easier if I knew whose child it was." Castleton took him by the shoulder and turned him so that they were face to face. "What is the root of your unease? Do you fear that she was abused in some fashion?" Nicholas shrank back at the horror of such a thought. No. I only wished to know if there was someone she loved." "Other than you?" Castleton scoffed. His friend truly did not think logically when he was overwrought about Lady Kathleen. He chuckled as he shook his head. Nicholas Sidemore was logical and analytical to a fault, and had been all his life, until he had fallen for Kathleen Witherfield. She was the only area in the man's life where logic liked to take a holiday on such a grand scale. She refused Dunnaby, and the child is her cousin. The child's mother died shortly after giving birth, and if you'll remember, Barrett Witherfield was killed in that fire. The child is her cousin? Yes, a baby girl who's been left an orphan and taken in by her relations. What a tragic way for a child to begin her life. Of course, Kathleen would take the child and care for her cousin as if she were her own. That was how Kathleen was. She had a capacity for empathy that few possessed. Many had been sorry to see her leave, for they would miss her visits and the help she provided for them, which she said she did on behalf of her father. However, Nicholas was not so certain that the late Earl Witherfield had much care for any who were beneath him. "You still have not told me your plan." Castleton was standing with his arms folded and an easy smile on his lips. It had been an empty threat. How had he been so fortunate to acquire such a good friend as Adam Castleton? Nicholas ran the gold chain of the locket between his fingers. "It seems I have a locket to return." He cast one last glance at the church, and with any luck, she will accept both it and me. Chapter 6. Kathleen glared at her brother as he handed her down from the carriage. There had been a tirade of words which had greeted him when he had gotten into the carriage at the apothecary's shop. Then, when he had insisted that a stop at Hazelton House was not in the best interest of anyone, and would not be happening, there had been silence. Loud, painful, accusing silence. He held her hand firmly after helping her from the carriage, though she attempted to pull it away. "Both you and Anya need rest," he said. Anya was already well on her way to the nursery in the arms of her nurse. Kathleen was not happy about that either. She had wanted to be the one to present Anya's new home to her. But he had intervened. His sister needed to see to herself first, and then she could look in on their cousin. "The journey has been arduous," he sighed when she continued to glower at him. "I only wish for the best for you, Kathy. Whether you believe me or not, it is what I have always sought." She shrugged, but remained silent. The rapid blinking of her eyes tore at his heart. How deeply he had hurt her by not lending his support to Mr. Sidemore's cause. But he had truly thought it a poor match. How could he subject his sister, who had been raised in luxury, to a life such as a man with little income posed? He should have listened to her pleas when she told him that Sidemore was not doomed to being poor. He should have also heeded her loud declaration about never marrying anyone, but most especially not someone he or her father selected. "I know I have been wrong about things in the past, but of this I am certain. If you speak to him now while you are tired and angry, you will regret your words, and you know I am right." He tucked her hand into his elbow and held it there as they walked toward the house. "You know how Sidemore is. He ponders. He analyzes all the sides of a situation before he comes to a decision. It is a process that cannot be rushed. I once thought it a fault, one which would see too many opportunities for advancement pass him by. But I have come to admire the trait." He shrugged. "I have even tried to emulate it since father passed. I wish I had seen the good in his methods before we left. Had I evaluated as closely the pleasing manners of that scoundrel Dunnaby, I would never have supported his suit or encouraged his travelling with us." He took a deep breath. "I am sorry, Kathleen. Had I been more discerning, I might have saved you heartache, and you, Anya and I might still have our fathers." "No," she said, breaking her silence. "I knew of Dunnaby's duplicity in his affections for me, but none could have known his full intentions. Not even I thought him capable of attempting to steal father's money. While he may not have designed father and uncle's deaths, I hold him responsible. Him." She paused as she remembered the night that the fire had started, and how her father and uncle had been trapped by falling timber. Dunnaby, whose shoes had been wet from the recent rain, had slipped as he entered the study through the door to the garden. Unfortunately, while stumbling and attempting to regain his footing, his candle had caught a book on fire just before Rupert had hit his head on the corner of the desk. It was a blow that had been hard enough to render him senseless for a few minutes, but still Dunnaby had been fortunate to escape the inferno to which he had awoken. He had also been fortunate to receive an opportunity to escape death by sailing for the West Indies. She rested her head against her brother's arm. He had been wise to offer Rupert the chance. As much as she wished Dunnaby dead, she had not wished for the public exposure a trial would have brought. "It is not for you to bear the full weight of any of it, dear brother. Was not father as much to blame, if not more so, for my heartache?" "Yes," he answered. Is he then to be held accountable for his own death? Kathleen continued. For if I use your logic, he is. I still feel responsible, he whispered. They had reached the steps and knew their discussion of such topics must be reserved until they were once again alone. You are not, she replied in an equally soft voice. Douglas saw her into the house, and then spoke briefly to his butler before turning once again to her. I will not argue the point further, he said with a smile. However, I will take your words as partial forgiveness for your unhappiness while we were away. And perhaps I shall earn complete forgiveness when Sidemore calls on you today. Today? Her eyebrows rose in surprise. Did you not just remind me that he needs time to analyze his feelings for me? A combination of hurt and anger coloured her words. He drew her down the hall toward the stairs. It seems I am wrong again, dear sister. Her brows furrowed and she wore a scowl. He laughed at her expression and kissed her softly on the forehead. I am wrong, my dear sister, for the man awaits me in my study. I shall be giving him my blessing. The decision will be, as it should have always been, entirely yours. Now, go freshen yourself. He turned her toward the stairs but pulled her back so he could whisper in her ear. And do try to wash away some of your anger. Your happiness may depend upon it. Chapter 7. Half an hour later, after she'd washed, changed into a new dress, restyled her hair, and taken a quick peek into the nursery to see that Anya was contentedly lying in her bed playing with a rattle, Kathleen found herself standing at the door to the sitting room. Nicholas stood looking out the window. The morning light cast a glow around him. She rested a hand on her rapidly beating heart in an attempt to slow it. He was here. She was no watering pot, but tears were threatening to fall as she watched him. His shoulders lifted and lowered as he audibly expelled a breath. He shifted his weight from one foot to another. He swung something around his finger and caught it in his hand before curling his fingers around it in a tight fist. Taking a deep breath and gathering her thoughts, she entered the room. Good morning, Mr. Sidemore. She crossed the room and sat in one of the wing-back chairs which were grouped to take in the perspective of the garden. It is a beautiful morning. I must say I was glad there were no further delays in reaching port, for I was anxious to be home. He had stilled at her voice, and now turned slowly towards her. Her breath caught in her chest as she waited to see what his response to her would be. He had come to call on her brother, but to what purpose? Was it the one for which she hoped, or were those hopes to be forever dashed? Good morning, Lady Kathleen. It is a very fine day. He smiled as he took a seat across from her. She studied his face. It had grown older in the time she had been away. There were creases near his eyes which had not been there before, but in her opinion they only added to his handsome features and spoke of the cautious character of the man she loved. It was the same cautiousness that she saw in his eyes now. I'm glad you came to call. I had intended to stop at Hazelton House on my way home, but my brother would not allow it. Your brother told me, and I must apologize. He stood again. The hand he had clasped as he stood near the window slowly opened. Your brother gave this to me this morning. He said it was meant for me, but he offered no other explanation. He let the locket fall on its chain and dangle there. And you assumed that the brother, who quite forcefully disapproved of your suit, had found a reason to find you acceptable? He nodded. I wish I were not the sort who questions all things and sees disaster where there is none, but I am. He smiled sheepishly at her. You have every right to be angry with me for having ever thought such a thing about you. Good, for I am. A small bit of anger still resided in her, but not as much as she had felt at the apothecary's shop. Her brother had been wise to make her wait and refresh herself before confronting Nicholas, but, to be honest, having him here with her was too precious a thing to risk losing, and was a far greater salve to her frayed emotions than anything else could ever be. He sighed resignedly and held the locket out to her. Do you want it back? She tipped her head so that she could see his face. Do you wish for me to have it? He blinked. No. What if the child had been mine? Would you want me to take it back then? I considered that, when I went home this morning. He studied the locket in his hand and smiled. I do not ever wish for you to have it back until you wear it at our wedding. There is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do which will ever end my love for you. He held his hand out to her, the locket lying in his palm. But if you do not wish to accept me, then I would not be able to keep this. It would pain me too much to see it, for it would remind me of the greatest treasure I had ever lost. The choice is yours." Kathleen ran a finger lightly over the locket before wrapping his fingers around it. "I have looked at that locket every day for over a year, and have been reminded of the love which may have been lost." She looked at him quickly before looking again at his closed hand. "I left it at the church, but my maid returned it to me. I would have sent word to you, but my father would not allow it." She smiled at him through her tears. "I thought I had no hope. I thought you would think I had rejected your offer and would not wait for me. But you did. You did wait for me." She shook her head as she squeezed his hand more tightly closed around the locket. "I made my choice before I left. I chose you then, and I choose you now." "You will marry me?" She laughed at the uncertainty in his voice. "Most happily I will marry you." "Oh, my darling Kathleen." He stood and pulled her to her feet before wiping a tear away from her eye with the tips of his fingers. "How I have longed for this moment. I have dreamt of it, and upon waking, I have wept over the loss of it." He drew her into his arms. "But you are truly here, are you not?" "I am, my love. I am." She delighted in the way he held her so tightly, as if he were afraid she would be snatched away from him. Or perhaps that was how she was clinging to him. He pressed a kiss to her hair before loosening his hold on her so that he could look into her eyes. "Do you know what Mr. Baxter would often say to me this past year?" She shook her head. Their parson was so full of quotes and sayings that she was certain she could not pick which he would use. He would say, "Weeping endures for the night, my boy, but joy comes in the morning. You must hope for the dawn, for it is coming." And he was right. My joy sailed into the harbour at dawn today. A smile split his face as the joy of which he spoke washed over his features. He brushed a thumb across her lips. "My hope, my longing, my weeping has turned to joy. I love you, Kathleen Witherfield, and I always will." There was no uncertainty in his voice or his eyes as he held her gaze for a moment before lowering his head and pressing his lips to hers. There was only joy. This has been Hope at Dawn, a Nature's Fury and Delights novelette, written by Leanie Brown, narrated by Christopher, an authorized voice replica. The 2019 copyright for Hope at Dawn is held by Leanie Brown, all rights reserved.